to do this problem, this is a lot like the problems we did yesterday, where we found the midpoint in one dimension on a number line, except now we've introduced another number line. We have a horizontal number line and a vertical number line in the coordinate plane. So we want to find the midpoint in 2 dimensions. It's going to be exactly the same, except we have to do it twice. We're going to have to find the midpoint twice in each dimension. And here's what I mean by that. If I look at just the x-coordinates, so the point on the left has an x-coordinate of -5. How do I know which one's the x-coordinate? How do I know that -5 is the x-coordinate, not the 7? Because x always comes first, right? So that point is going to correspond to the number -5 on the x-axis. So this right here is where -5 is on the x-axis. This right here is where 3 is on the x-axis. So if I'm just looking at the x-axis, how would I find the midpoint between -5 and 3? Yeah. Add them up and divide by 2. Or take the average. All right? So to find that midpoint on the x-axis, we're just going to take the average. How do we take the average, or how do we find the average of -5 and 3? Somebody tell me, what do we actually do? What's the math there? Find the average of -5 and 3.
-5 plus 3 divided by 2.
And that gives us what? What's -5 plus 3?
-2.
-2 divided by 2? -1. So the average of those 2 x-coordinates is going to be -1. And if you notice, that -1 corresponds to the x-coordinate of our midpoint. Does that make sense? If we want to find the y-coordinate of our midpoint, we do the same thing. We look at where those 2 points lie on the y-axis. So the left point is at 7 on the y-axis, and the right point is at 1 on the y-axis. So here I have y equals 7, y equals 1. If I want to find the midpoint, or the y-coordinate of the point halfway in between, what am I going to do here? Take the average. Okay, same answer as all the other ones we've done. We're going to take the average of those 2. And how do we take the average of 7 and 1? 7 plus 1 is? Divided by 2 is? 4. So we get 4 for the average of the y-coordinates. And notice that 4 corresponds to the y-coordinate of the midpoint. So, where is the midpoint? What are the coordinates of the midpoint here? -1, 4, or 4, -1? -1, 4, right? We'll put the x first. So the x-coordinate of the midpoint is -1. The y-coordinate is 4, so the midpoint is at -1, 4. At no point here did we have to use the midpoint formula that I showed you yesterday. I gave you a midpoint formula, but you don't really need it. Just understand that the midpoint is going to be the average of the x's to get the x-coordinate, and the average of the y's to get the y-coordinate. Remember, when you're finding a midpoint for a point, you need an x and a y. So to find the x's, you average the x's. To find the y, you average the y's. Let's do the same thing here, but we'll do it with some generic points. You may not be able to read it, so I wrote the points over there on the board. That says x1, y1, and x2, y2. So those are just generic points. X and y could be anything for either one of those two. How would we find the number halfway between the x's? So halfway between x1 and x2. Austin?
x1 plus x2 equals, x1 plus x2 divided by 2.
Perfect. So we would take the average of those two, and as Austin said, we add them together and divide by 2, and it's going to be x1 plus x2 divided by 2. And how would we find the y-coordinate of the midpoint? The number halfway between y1 and y2. Austin?
Y y1 plus y2 divided by 2 equals y.
Okay, good. So the y coordinate is going to be the average of the two y's, which is y1 and y2. So we take the average of that and we get y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So what is the midpoint here for these 2 points? What are the coordinates? Somebody besides Austin. Unless it's that Austin. What's the x-coordinate of the midpoint? It's up there, guys. x1 plus x2 divided by 2. And what's the y-coordinate? y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So the midpoint here is exactly that. Now, I don't actually like this formula a whole lot. And the reason is the formula itself is more complicated than the process of doing it. We know how to find the average of two numbers, right? I hope. To take the average of two numbers, you would add the two numbers together and divide by 2. So if you just remember, to find the x-coordinate of the midpoint, you take the average of the x's. To find the y-coordinate, you take the average of the y's. You don't have to remember this formula, x1 plus x2 divided by 2, comma, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. If you just try to memorize formulas, there's too good of a chance of you making a little mistake that's going to cost you. Right, Tatiana? Okay, does everybody have this written down from yesterday? Let's use it. Let's do a couple examples here. So what I would like you to do is plot the points and then find their midpoint. First thing I want to say is you do not have to make tick marks for every single number on the number line. There will be problems that I'll have you do on the assessments or on worksheets where you're going to have numbers like 15. You don't have to make 15 tick marks. All you need to do if you're going to plot a point like 2, 3 is put a tick mark where you want the 2 to be, put a tick mark where you want the 3 to be, and plot the point. Now, just a quick refresher, how do I know that point goes there? I know we haven't talked about it yet in this class. It is something that I expect you to know from your past experiences, but just in case, how do I know where the point 2, 3 goes? What does the 2 tell me? What's that? Okay, so the 2 here tells me that we're going to go to 2 on the x-axis, and the 3 tells me we're going to go to 3 on the y-axis. So 2 on the x-axis is here, 3 on the y-axis is here. So if I go straight up from the 2 on the x-axis, and if I go straight over from the 3 on the y-axis, I get my point 2, 3. Same thing with the point 4, 7. It looks like 4 should be about there if the 2 is where it is, and 7 should be a little bit more than double what the 3 is, so 7 might be about there. So 4, 7 is going to be 4 on the x-axis, 7 on the y-axis, and we get a point right about there. You guys agree with that? Okay, so let me ask this question now. What kinds of shapes have midpoints? We want to find the midpoint. We're not actually finding the midpoint of those 2 points. We're finding the midpoint of anybody know? Not a line, but you're close. A line segment, exactly. So we want to find the midpoint of a segment. So let me draw the segment in here. So we want to find the midpoint of this line segment right here. A line segment is really the only shape that has a midpoint, because of the way we define a midpoint. That's the only kind of shape that can. So we want to find the midpoint of that line segment. I'll put a point here where I think it should be, or about where I think it should be. So I think the midpoint should be there. How do we find the coordinates of that point? How do you find the x-coordinate? Who can help me find the x-coordinate of that midpoint? 2 plus what, Maya? Oh, hold on. No. So I'm going to call it x sub m. M standing for midpoint. So it's the x-coordinate of the midpoint is going to be what, Maya? No.
Or is it the 2 plus 4?
Remember, the x-coordinate of the midpoint is the average of the x's, right?
So is it 2 plus 4?
So it's going to be 2 plus 4
Divided by 2.
divided by 2. What's 2 plus 4, Maya? Divided by 2? Okay. So the average of the x's is 3. Who can help me find the average of the y's to find the y-coordinate of the midpoint? Jake?
3 plus divided by 2.
Which is?
5.
Okay. So that means that the coordinates of the midpoint, I'm going to call it capital M. Remember, we use capital letters for points. The coordinates of the midpoint will be what? 3, 5. And if I plot that, or at least if I look at what corresponds to the point that I drew earlier, does that look like it could be 3, 5 there? Yeah, 3 is the number halfway between 2 and 4. 5 is the number halfway between 3 and 7. Does that make sense? It's pretty easy, isn't it? Okay, let's try another one. So I want you to find the midpoint of these 2 points, -1, 6, and 7, 2. I'll give you a little bit of time on your own to do this. Alright, so I've got the points plotted on here. Like I said, you don't have to add tick marks for each number. One thing I do want to emphasize, though, is try to make it as accurate as you can. It wouldn't make sense for me to put the -1 on the x-axis here and then put the 7 on the x-axis here. Okay, so notice that I have the 7 quite a bit farther from the origin than I have the -1. And also notice that I have the 6 about 3 times as far from the origin as I have the 2. So try to make it somewhat accurate so that when you get an answer, you can check the reasonableness of your answer by looking at the picture. Okay, so we want to find the midpoint here. Who can help me with the x-coordinate? Don?
-1 plus 7 divided by 2.
Okay, and what is -7 or -1 plus 7?
6.
And divided by 2?
3.
All right, Don, you want to do the y-coordinate for me too?
No.
No? Okay. Anybody else? Austin?
6 plus 2 divided by 2.
Okay, what's 6 plus 2?
8.
Divided by 2?
4.
Okay, and so what are the coordinates of our midpoint? Allie?
3 and 4. 3, 4, 7.
All right. So, yeah, be sure we separate with a comma. Be sure you have parentheses around it. If you don't put parentheses around an ordered pair, it's really not an ordered pair, so it doesn't mean what you want it to mean, so be careful about that. So if I put the midpoint in our picture here, looks like it should be right about there. Does that look like that would correspond about to 3 and 4? Yeah, 3 is halfway between -1 and 7. It looks like we hit that pretty well. 4 is halfway between 2 and 6. All right, any questions about this one? One more like this, and then we'll do one that's a little bit different. Does the fact that this is a vertical line really affect how we do this at all? No. We can still find the coordinates of the midpoint by doing exactly the same thing we've been doing. One of them will be, in my opinion, easier than they've been, because there's, especially if you understand what average means, you don't really have to do the work for it. We'll go ahead and do it anyway, though. How do we find the coordinates of the x-coordinate of the midpoint? Kayla? 2 plus 2 divided by 2. Now, my favorite is when people write down 2 plus 2 divided by 2 on their paper, and then they tell me that it's 3. Really not my favorite. But if you were to type this in your calculator, just like this, I know I've shown this type of thing to you before. If you type in 2 plus 2 divided by 2 without using parentheses correctly, then that 2 divided by 2 is going to be evaluated first, and you get 2 plus 1 is 3. Now, that's the same thing as saying that the average of 2 and 2 is 3. Does that make sense? No. No, the number halfway between 2 and 2 has to be... Oh my gosh. 2. Okay, good. The number halfway between 2 and 2, since it's the same thing, has to be 2. So be careful don't rely too much on the calculator, or if you do, be sure you know how to use it correctly. But the average of 2 and 2 is 2. So our x-coordinate is going to be 2. If you notice that here, if you notice that you have the same x-coordinate, the midpoint is going to have that same x-coordinate. Because the midpoint is between the 2 points. The only number that you could really say is between 2 and 2, even though it's not between them, it is the same thing, is that same number, 2. How about finding the y-coordinate of the midpoint? Brittany?
Negative 5 plus 3 divided by 2.
Okay, and what's negative 5 plus 3?
Negative 2.
Divided by 2?
Negative 1.
Okay, so what are the coordinates of our midpoint, Tiffany?
It's 4, negative 1. No, 2 and negative 1.
Okay, thanks. So we get 2, negative 1, and again, if I plot that, I want to plot it to make sure that I got something that makes sense. My midpoint looks like it should be right about there, and that does look like it corresponds to negative 1 on the y-axis. Okay? Any questions about these? These are pretty easy, aren't they? When they might get a little bit trickier is when we start doing some other stuff with points. Instead of just finding midpoints, we'll also find distances between points. We'll find slopes between points. And so you'll have to keep straight, when do I find averages, when do I use the Pythagorean theorem, when do I find the distances between them instead of averaging them. So we're gonna start all that other stuff tomorrow. We'll do distance formula tomorrow, maybe a little bit of slope tomorrow. And so when it gets tricky is keeping all that stuff straight. Okay, last problem. This one's a little bit different. So I'm giving you one of the endpoints, A, and the midpoint, M. You have to find the other endpoint. So we have segment AB. M is the midpoint. I want to know what the other endpoint is. We're going to do this 2 ways. I'm going to do it the long way first using the formula, and then we're going to talk about an easier way, a simpler way to do it without using the formula, just using the idea of what it means for something to be the average. So we'll start by plotting the points. I'll go ahead and do that while you do. On this problem, I also strongly recommend labeling the points, because this is going to be one where it's a very good idea to have a visual of what our answers should look like, so that we can check, again, the reasonableness of our answer in the end. Who can tell me about where the other point should be, the third point, that other end point? Austin, you think you can? So we can reasonably say that our other endpoint should be somewhere in, and I'm going to make it kind of big, but somewhere in that region, right? So we're going to go from A to M, and then we're going to continue from M to the other endpoint in the same direction. Does that make sense? So we're going to get another endpoint. Point B is going to be somewhere in there. So let's use that formula that we've been using, the midpoint formula, to figure out what the coordinates are and see if we get an answer that makes sense. Let me simplify the formula for you, and we'll just look at the x part of the formula. So the x coordinate of the midpoint is going to be the average of the x's, so x1 plus x2 divided by 2. So using that formula, how can we find the x coordinate of our other point, of point B? Which numbers, out of the 4 numbers there, 2, negative 5, negative 1, and negative 2, which ones am I going to use to find the x coordinate?
2 and negative 1.
The 2 and the negative 1, right? So where are the 2 and the negative 1 going to go?
What do you mean where I'm going?
Where are they going to go in that formula? This formula up here.
Oh,
Above
x
2.
2.
Both of them?
Yeah.
They're both going to, so it's going to be 2 plus negative 1 divided by 2?
No.
No, remember x1 and x2 are the x coordinates of the endpoints. We don't know one of those. One of them is the x coordinate of the midpoint, right? So which one should go first, Raven? Were you going to tell me what to do, or did you have a question?
I was going to tell you what.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I used the formula that you used at the top, and I kind of plugged everything in.
Okay, so what'd you plug in?
I found I found x first, and I did -1.
Okay, good. So -1 is the x-coordinate of the midpoint. So this right here is the x-coordinate of the midpoint, so we'll start with that. Equals?
2 plus x2, since x2 is what I did.
Okay,
Divided by 2.
perfect. A lot of 2's in that right side, right? Okay, so that's exactly right. So we've got this 2 right here. That's the x-coordinate of one of the endpoints, so we'll put that in for x1. This -1 here is the x-coordinate of the midpoint, so we'll put that in there. And then this other x-coordinate for the other endpoint we don't know, so we'll leave that as a variable. Now how do we solve for that variable, Raven?
Multiply both sides.
Okay, if we multiply both sides by 2, we get -2 equals 2 plus x2. And then how do we get x2 by itself?
Subtract 2 from both sides.
Subtract 2 from both sides, and we get x2 equals what? -4. Good. Sorry, I'm kind of cramming it in here, but you get the idea, right? Okay, so that gives us the x-coordinate of the other endpoint. How about the y-coordinate? I'm not going to write the formula down because the formula is what? It's the same thing, except all the x's up here are y's. So what is the y-coordinate of the midpoint? -2. Okay, what's the y-coordinate of the endpoint that we know? -1, and then we don't know the other one, so I'll call that y2 divided by 2.
Wait, it's
I said -5.
You said -5? I wasn't listening, apparently. That better? Okay, so -2 equals -5 plus the y-coordinate of the other endpoint, y2, divided by 2. What do we do to get y2 by itself?
multiply 2 on both sides.
Okay, multiply by 2 on both sides, we get -4 equals -5 plus y2, not y squared, y2. Okay,
And then add the 5 from both
add 5 to both sides, we get y2 equals,
-1.
how about positive?
+1.
Positive 1. Okay. So what are the coordinates now of point B? Okay, and if I plot that, -4, 1, does it look like we get a point right about here, where Austin predicted? Does that look like it would be about -4 and positive 1? I think so. I think we did a pretty good job there. Okay. Again, graphing this as accurately as you can is helpful because then you can check to see if your answer is reasonable. If your scale on your axes are all messed up and they're different distances at different places, then it's hard to really check to see if your answer makes sense. Yes? Sure. You're going to miss the easy way to do this, though. Okay. Yeah. Let's do this again. Let's just look at the x-axis here. We've got a problem. Just along the x-axis, let's say we go from 2 to -1. What would you expect we would do to get to the other endpoint along the x-axis? Austin?
Over 3,
Why?
because that's halfway. So
Yeah. This right here, going from 2 to -1, we're going down by 3. So exactly as Austin suggested, we're going to go down another 3 to get to our other endpoint. So if we go down by another 3, what are we going to get to, Austin?
you're going to get to -4.
We get to -4. So all we're doing here is we're looking at this as an arithmetic sequence. We start at 2 on the x-axis. We go down 3 to get to the midpoint. So we go down another 3 to get to -4, which is going to be at the other endpoint. Does that make sense? No? Does that kind of make sense?
Yep.
So remember the midpoint is the arithmetic mean or the average of the other two. So we can look at this as an arithmetic sequence. The same thing with the y's. If we go from -5 on the y-axis to -2 on the y-axis, I'll draw a line in here for you to represent that. So we go from -5 to -2 on the y-axis. What are we doing there? We're going up by 3. So if we go up another 3, what are we going to get to?
1.
You see how he's getting that? So we go up 3 to go from -5 to -2. So we go up another 3 and we get to +1 on the y-axis right there. And so that means that I know there's a lot of stuff going on here now, but that means that our other endpoint B is going to be at 1 on the y-axis and -4 on the x-axis. So B is going to have the coordinates -4, 1. Does that make sense? To me, I think this is a lot easier. If you start at one endpoint, 2, go down by 3, so figure out how far you go on the x-axis, do it again, you get to the other endpoint, and the same thing on the y-axis. Go up by 3, go up by 3. Does that make sense? Okay. The worksheet I gave you yesterday, you have to do both of those types of problems. So